On Saturday, May 4th, 2019, the day started like any other for Iman Nasser, a 17-year-old from Manchester, England. Recently becoming a new mother, she was still adjusting to this exciting phase of her life. However, the day took an unexpected turn when her ex-boyfriend and the father of her baby, 17-year-old Red Kardashian, called to inform her that he was coming to visit. Despite their breakup and Red's involvement with a new girl named Sarah Muhammad, arrival of their baby had brought them closer again. Shortly after the call, Red arrived at Iron Man's room and the ex-lovers engaged in an intimate encounter. However, within minutes Red suddenly and violently stabbed a man multiple times. The question arises, what could have triggered Red's sudden outburst of violence? Was he under the influence of drugs? Or was there a more terrifying reason behind his actions? It is important to note that Manchester, where this tragic incident took place, is a major city in the Greater Manchester area with a population of 552,000 as of 2021. The city is renowned for its football clubs, Manchester United and Manchester City, attracting fans from around the world. While the crime rate in Greater Manchester was 98.2 per 1,000 people in 2019, it is also a diverse and welcoming city with a rich historical heritage and esteemed universities. Iman Nasser, born in 2002 in Openshaw, Manchester, lived in the city with her family. Growing up in a close-knit family with 2 sisters and 2 brothers, Iman's upbringing was deeply rooted in her Islamic faith. Her family regularly attended the local mosque, instilling a strong sense of faith in her from a young age. Iman's personality radiated through her intelligence and charisma, excelling both academically and socially. She easily made friends and was a dedicated sister to her siblings. Her love for babies was so profound that she aspired to become a midwife in the future. However, in 2013, Iman's life took a different path when she met Rick Kartshaw, her classmate at Manchester Academy. Initially, their relationship seemed caring and protective, but over time, Rhett's behavior became controlling and abusive. As Iman's relationship with Rhett deteriorated, his behavior became increasingly abusive. He would engage in flirtations with other girls, cheat on her, lie to her, and even resort to physical violence whenever she questioned him. As a result, Iman's once vibrant social life began to fade away. She became withdrawn and isolated, afraid of upsetting Rhett, but also fearful of leaving him. Iman's friends and family noticed the distressing change in her behavior, but unfortunately, they were unable to separate the couple. Despite these challenges, Iman remained dedicated to her studies and managed to earn good grades in high school. She had plans to attend college, hoping for a fresh start away from the toxic relationship. However, at the age of 16, during her junior year of high school, Iman's situation became even more complicated when she discovered that she was pregnant with Rhett's child. This news clashed with her family's traditional expectations, and her mother was disappointed and angry. Initially, Iman's decision to keep the baby was met with resistance, but eventually her family accepted her choice and offered their support. At first, Rhett appeared to be happy about the pregnancy and assured Iman that they would work things out. However, his initial excitement quickly faded, and he reverted back to his old ways as the pregnancy progressed. Iman found herself torn between her loyalty to Rhett and her love for her unborn child. Unbeknownst to Iman, Rhett had started a relationship with another student named Sarah Muhammad. Sarah had always desired Rhett, so when he asked her out, she saw it as an opportunity. However, upon learning of Iman's pregnancy, Sarah's jealousy transformed into a vicious rage. Torn between the 2 women, Red ultimately chose Sarah, leaving Iman to face her pregnancy alone. Iman struggled with the breakup, but the arrival of her baby boy, Keenan, gave her strength. In March 2019, she gave birth to a healthy child, despite Red's absence during the birth and his continued emotional distance. However, the presence of their child only fueled Sarah's rage and jealousy. She found it unbearable that a man Rhett still had a connection through their baby, and her resentment reached toxic new heights. Meanwhile, a man was completely engrossed in taking care of her baby, oblivious to the ominous presence lurking in the shadows. Despite no longer being in a romantic relationship, a man and Rhett managed to maintain a friendship and frequently cross paths. However, when Sarah discovered their continued connection, she was filled with anger and promptly ended her relationship with Rhett. Unwilling to let go, Rhett was determined to salvage their bond and arrange a lunch meeting with Sarah on Friday, May 3, 2019, hoping to convince her to stay with him. The following day, on May 4, 2019, 17-year-old Rhett visited Iman's house while her mother was away, with Sarah waiting outside. Initially, Red appeared friendly as he caught up with Aman and reminisced about old times. However, his demeanor suddenly shifted. He retrieved a large kitchen knife from his bag and launched a vicious attack on Aman. A struggle ensued, but Aman summoned her strength and managed to push him away, fleeing into the garden. Red relentlessly pursued her, continuing the assault by brazenly stabbing her in the face, neck, armpit, and back 3 times. As Aman lay bleeding and fighting for her life, Red fled the scene and rendered vows with Sarah. The two embraced, engaged in conversation, and swiftly returned to Sarah's residence. Little did they anticipate that Aman would survive. One of her brothers had witnessed her bleeding in the garden and rushed her to the hospital. Red's escape was short-lived as the police apprehended him at a bus stop, clutching 2 bags containing blood-stained clothing and a bloody knife. Now in custody, Red faced intense questioning from the authorities. Through his responses and their subsequent investigation, the police pieced together the sequence of events. The tragic incident was set in motion during Red and Sarah's lunch meeting on Friday, May 3, 2019. Sarah's fury over Red's continued involvement with Aman led her to demand the ultimate proof of his love and commitment, the murder of Aman. She wanted him to go to great lengths to win back her affection. Red's phone records indicated that following the meeting, he had conducted online searches regarding asphyxiation and the potential penalties for murder. The investigation uncovered that Sarah had persistently pressured Red, bombarding him with numerous text messages instructing him to document his actions and share the footage as proof. Fortunately for Aman, Red's attempts at executing the plan have failed and her family promptly rushed her to the hospital. Aman underwent multiple surgeries and remained hospitalized for a duration of 4 days, as she had sustained severe injuries from a total of 15 stab wounds. The doctors confirmed that considering the severity of the assault, she was incredibly fortunate to have survived. During the police interrogation, Aman recounted that Red had posed disturbing questions during his visit on that fateful day. He inquired whether she would be willing to end her own life for him, if he should end hers, and how he should go about it. Red confessed to Aman that he was being coerced into terminating her life, claiming that failure to comply could result in harm to this family. He even requested her assistance in faking a strangulation, suggesting that she apply makeup to her neck to simulate the appearance of a choke mark, which he intended to photograph. Reluctantly, Ayman agreed and proceeded to apply the makeup, closing her eyes as he captured the staged image. However, upon opening her eyes, she was met with a horrifying sight. Red holding a large kitchen knife. Filled with fear, Ayman attempted to dial the emergency services, but he forcefully prevented her from doing so. Fearing for her life, she implored him to leave. A struggle ensued, and summoning her strength, Aman managed to escape from the room and flee into the garden. It was there that Red ultimately attacked her with the knife, inflicting over 15 stab wounds to her head, neck, and back. Following the savage assault, Red swiftly fled the scene, having prepared a change of clothes and sneakers to discard the blood-stained attire he had worn during the attack, highlighting the extent of his premeditation. He was apprehended. The items he had in his possession included a kitchen knife, a green sports bag, and clothing and sneakers stained with blood. Additionally, there was an open pack of wipes, some of which had been used, presumably for cleaning the knife. Shortly after, 17-year-old Sarah Muhammad was arrested. Her phone was seized, revealing messages urging Red to be cautious about leaving behind any DNA evidence, as it could lead to imprisonment. Furthermore, the messages requested that he record the attacks so that she could view it before deleting the evidence and disposing of the phone. The detectives also discovered that while Sarah was waiting outside Aman's house, she bombarded Red with over 50 texts, actively encouraging his actions. Among these messages, one stood out, stating, "Why are you taking so long? Hurry up and do it." What followed were a series of chilling messages that exposed the dark side of Red and Sarah's relationship. In response to Sarah, Red wrote, "I did it to prove I love you. There was no other way to keep you." Sarah replied, "I know there wasn't. I'm going to protect you at all costs." Shockingly, she even offered to assist him in obtaining a new identity, assuring him, "I would have done the same for you." Investigators were appalled that high school teenagers could harbor such sinister thoughts. Red Cardi Shaw was charged with attempted murder and possession of a dangerous weapon, while his girlfriend, Sarah Muhammad, was charged with intentionally encouraging and assisting in the commission of murder. Initially, Red was also charged with assault based on the hospital's examination of Aman, but this charge was dropped when Aman confirmed that it was consensual. Prior to the trial, Sarah Muhammad changed her name to Kairo Mori Akihiro. The trial took place in December 2019 at Manchester Crown Court, where a courageous Amin Nasser confronted her attackers as she provided her testimony recounting how the incident unfolded. On that fateful day, Amin received a phone call from Rhett informing her that he was en route to her residence. At that moment, she was sound asleep inside the house while her sisters were busy preparing food in the kitchen. Meanwhile, her mother had stepped out with her newborn baby. When Rhett arrived at her doorstep, he carried a green plastic bag and wore black gloves. Inside the bag, there lay a black Adidas hoodie and matching trousers. Rhett claimed that his intention was to donate these clothes to charity, but a man expressed her desire to examine them, which sparked an argument between them. Subsequently, when she retreated to her room, Rhett followed her and settled into the gaming chair, drawing closer to her. A man testified in court that he began touching her thighs and chest, kissing her neck, nose, and face, almost forcing himself upon her. Although she felt angered by his behavior, she eventually succumbed, and the two engaged in intimate relations within her bedroom. Later, their conversation took a disturbing turn as Rhett broached the topic of her demise. According to a man, Rhett gazed into the mirror and made unsettling remarks, including threats towards his own family. Frightened, she called out to her sister, but Rhett swiftly silenced her, assuring her that he had no harmful intentions. Suddenly, the tone of their conversation shifted once Morris's phone incessantly beat with a barrage of text messages. He emphasized the seriousness of his threats. In response, a man threatened to contact someone unless he revealed the contents of the messages. However, Rhett attempted to conceal the messages from her as he perused them. These messages, sent by Kira Mori, also known as Sarah, were the final catalyst. The situation escalated from emotional distress to outright violence as Rhett launched an attack on Iman with a knife. Iman also provided insights into Kira Mori's life, describing her as a demonic girl with a fascination for dark and gothic themes. She labeled Kira Mori as a manipulative and delusional teenager who could not accept that Iman had been involved with Rhett prior to her. Iman believed that Kira Mori had been stalking her on social media, which contributed to her feelings of insecurity. Amanda's testimony was filled with intense emotions as she recounted the harrowing experience she had endured. She described how her life had been completely transformed, struggling to find a sense of safety and even sleep at night. The daunting task of rebuilding her life now forced her to become a stay-at-home parent, solely responsible for caring for her child. Shockingly, Amand did not receive any form of apology from the perpetrators, which deeply affected her. She expressed her frustration, highlighting that no one had considered the fact that her son was only 2 months old at the time, and she had recently undergone a C-section at 35 weeks. Despite her powerful testimony, Kira Mori, also known as Sarah, disagreed with the court's account of the events. She maintained her innocence, claiming that she believed Rhett was planning to end his relationship with a man. Kira Mori explained her messages as an attempt to have their breakup recorded on his phone as evidence of their separation. However, her explanation failed to sway anyone. Throughout the court proceedings, Kira Mori was observed smiling and even laughing, displaying a complete lack of remorse. Both Rhett and Kira Mori, who were 17 years old at the time of the trial, were ultimately found guilty of all charges. During the sentencing, Judge Alan Conrad Keefe highlighted the disturbingly narcissistic behaviors exhibited by Rhett and Kira Mori, expressing disappointment in Kira Mori's actions. The judge emphasized that the victim was an innocent girl whom Kira Mori had never even met and who had caused her no harm. Even the defense team expressed profound sadness over the tragic nature of the case, underscoring how the incomprehensible actions of these two teenagers had irreversibly damaged their own futures. Initially, the media was prohibited from disclosing their names due to their age. However, following their conviction and in response to requests from the press, Judge Alan Conrad Keefe ordered that their identities be made public. Aman Nasser also chose to waive her anonymity rights, as she believed it was crucial for her story to be shared. On Friday, December 20th, 2019, Rhett Cardi Shaw was sentenced to 16 years in prison for attempted murder and possession of an offensive weapon. Kira Mori Akihiro, previously known as Sarah Muhammad, has been sentenced to 16 years in prison for her involvement in encouraging and assisting a person to commit murder. Following the conviction of the teenagers, Detective Inspector Jennifer Tattersall from Greater Manchester Police commended Iman's bravery and determination. She acknowledged the significant impact the traumatic event had had on the young woman who was left in a serious condition and praised her for coming forward to assist the police during the investigation. Aman Nasser expressed her satisfaction with the outcome of the trial, stating that she achieved the results she desired. She also expressed gratitude towards the police for their assistance and support, and voiced her hope for a brighter future. Despite justice being served, Amand faces numerous challenges ahead. The incident has profoundly affected her perspective on life, leaving her in constant fear of potential harm. She disclosed that her family had relocated from Openshaw due to the traumatic incident and her deteriorating mental health. Amand now struggles to trust others and relies on medication to cope with the lingering effects of her ordeal. Although Amand's journey to recovery will be difficult, she remains determined to rebuild her life for the sake of her child. Her experience with a seemingly loving partner who turned violent serves as a reminder of the importance of vigilance and recognizing warning signs in relationships. As for the adequacy of the sentence given to Rhett and Cairo Mori, it is a matter open to interpretation and discussion. The case of Dupont de Ligons. In early April 2011, the shutters of house number 55 on Boulevard Robert Schumann in Nantes, France remained closed for the first time in years. This was unusual because the house, which belonged to the Dupont de Ligons family, was typically filled with the sounds of the family's 4 teenage children and their 2 dogs. The family consisted of Xavier, his wife Agnes, and their children. The neighbors, who were accustomed to seeing the shutters open even when the family was on vacation, noticed the unusual silence and alerted the local police, fearing something might have happened to the family. During the initial police inspections, no signs of the Dupont de Ligons family were found. However, on the 5th inspection, a horrific discovery was made. Xavier Dupont de Ligons was born on March 9, 1961, in Versailles, a western suburb of Paris. He was the eldest son of French Count Bernard Hubert Dupont de Ligons and his wife Genevieve Tertz. The family also had a daughter named Christine, born in 1966. When Bernard deserted his wife for a mistress, Xavier took on a leadership role in his family, caring for his mother and sister. Christine began to claim she received divine messages, which she transcribed during automatic writing sessions, similar to those of a surrealist poet. Her unusual beliefs gradually evolved into doomsday sermons, leading her to establish a cult called the Church of Philadelphia. This group attracted members of the aristocracy, whom Genevieve convinced were chosen to survive the impending apocalypse and participate in the world's rebirth. According to Genevieve, Christine was destined to give birth to the Savior, a child who would be the reincarnation of both Jesus and Satan and thus bring salvation. Although Xavier inherited his father's noble title, he showed little interest in French traditions, instead being captivated by luxury, high-performance cars, and eccentricities. He also greatly admired the United States. Genevieve financially supported Xavier's extravagant lifestyle through significant donations from cult members, who were sworn to secrecy about their activities. On the beautiful island of Breja in 1974, Xavier formed a strong and lasting bond with Emmanuel Teneur. The 2 boys developed a deep mutual understanding that continued throughout their lives. Although Emmanuel confessed his love for Xavier, which was rejected, their close friendship remained unaffected. 2 years later, Xavier met Agnes Hona, born on November 9, 1962, in Neuilly-sur-Seine, near Paris. Agnes was deeply devoted to her religion and worked as an assistant at the Blanche de Castille Catholic School in Nantes, where she taught catechism. While little is known about her family, it is well documented that Xavier and Agnes developed a close relationship, which led to a brief but passionate romance before they eventually parted ways. In 1990, Agnes gave birth to her first child, Arthur, from a casual relationship. Soon after, she and Xavier rekindled their romance and decided to tie the knot. Xavier adopted Arthur as his own son, and 2 years later they welcomed their first biological son, Thomas, who would carry on the family name. To mark the occasion, Xavier chose Emmanuel as Thomas's godfather. The couple went on to have 2 more children, Anne and Benoit. The family of 6 seemed to personify the ideal family unit, with Xavier appearing as a loving father and the children excelling academically, hinting at a bright future. Agnes was devoted to nurturing her children's faith, regularly taking them to Mass. Others perceived her as kind yet firm with her children. Around the year 2000, Xavier relocated his family to the United States, aligning with their individual interests and preferences. Xavier, a charismatic and multilingual individual with a discreet nature, was confident in his ability to blend in seamlessly in the United States. However, this endeavor ended in failure, resulting in substantial financial losses. Upon his return to France, he began to amass significant debts tied to his professional pursuits, which often seemed shrouded in ambiguity. Multiple investigations have portrayed him as a salesman. According to French media reports, financial struggles had been a persistent concern for Xavier over several years. One of Xavier's unsuccessful ventures was an unusual scheme to import cars from the United States to France. He also launched several small businesses, none of which saw significant success, including a hotel and restaurant guide for sales representatives, a customer loyalty system for restaurants, and an import scheme for cars from the United States to France. He was listed as the manager of the French Federation of Commerce, although the accounts for this enterprise were minimal. In 2003, he hired 6 salespeople to help turn his fortunes around. Xavier's work often took him away from home from Monday to Friday, earning him a meager annual income of around $4,200 in declared earnings. As financial issues began to strain his marriage, typical marital disagreements were likely exacerbated. In 2004, Agnes poured her heart out on a French forum, detailing the challenges she and her husband faced. She revealed that he had once told her that a group death as a family wouldn't be catastrophic, a haunting statement that would linger. By 2009, the mounting debt had severely impacted their relationship, leading to a temporary separation. During this period, Xavier sent numerous letters blaming Agnes for the family's troubles and holding her responsible for their financial ruin. This emotional turmoil took a devastating toll on Agnes, causing her to lose her appetite and struggle with insomnia on numerous occasions. Xavier sought help from his friend Emmanuel, who hailed from a wealthy family and had inherited a substantial fortune from his father. Despite his affluence, Emmanuel lived modestly in a small apartment, preferring to use his wealth to support others. He was an enigmatic and somewhat eccentric individual who never hesitated to lend Xavier significant sums of money. In addition to financial support, Emmanuel funded Xavier's travels and even co-signed for the house where Xavier eventually settled with his family in the late 2000s. Thanks to Emmanuel's generosity, the family resided in a cozy chalet located in the suburbs at 55 Boulevard Robert Schumann, west of N. As they settled in, the neighbors quickly formed the impression that Agnes was domineering and less pleasant than her husband. Behind closed doors, Agnes faced a personal crisis. She saw Xavier as both too fragile and paradoxically too rigid, almost militaristic in his behavior. While he played the role of head of the household, he was emotionally distant, lacking tenderness and affection, and sometimes even abusive. Agnes confided in her Thursday prayer group friends about her fears regarding Genevieve's control over Xavier. She painted her mother-in-law as a mentally unstable mystic, and her concerns ran deep. On January 20th, 2011, passed away, marking a significant turning point. Given the contrast between his lavish lifestyle and financial struggles, Xavier hoped his father's demise would yield a substantial inheritance. However, he was in for a rude awakening upon reviewing his father's estate, only to find a few papers, a rifle, a card, a ring, and some cash, which he promptly claimed. Within hours of Bernard's passing, Xavier used his father's card to withdraw cash. By February 2nd, he had obtained a firearms license, and by March 12th, he had purchased a silencer for the rifle. During this period, he also acquired quicklime and honed his shooting skills in his garden, targeting a balloon on a stand. When Emmanuel visited, he tried the rifle, unaware of any suspicious intent. Xavier downplayed the silencer, citing concerns about disturbing the neighbors. On Friday, April 1st, the two friends Bernard and Xavier visited a shooting range, where Bernard's inherited rifle drew considerable attention. The following day, Emmanuel called Xavier 5 times, and they engaged in a nearly hour-long conversation. The investigation suggests that the horror unfolded on Sunday, April 3rd. That evening, Xavier, Agnes, and their children went to the movies, followed by a pleasant dinner at a restaurant. Everyone was present except for Thomas, who was studying at a Catholic university and resided in a nearby student hostel. After their night out, the family returned to their chalet, where neighbors caught a glimpse of them, and some family members exchanged text messages with friends and acquaintances. Xavier sent a message to Christine, detailing their dinner outing. The prevailing theory is that Xavier drugged his wife and children, waiting for them to fall asleep before shooting and burying them in the garden. He also killed the family's 2 Labrador dogs. Xavier's alibi was as dubious as his actions. On Monday morning, he began contacting people in his family's social circle from as early as 6 a.m. He phoned Agnes' workplace, claiming she was unwell, and contacted the children's schools, stating that Arthur, Agnes' son from a previous relationship, had been in a motorcycle accident and that Anne and Benoit were ill. By midday, He sent a letter to the restaurant where Arthur worked, announcing Arthur's resignation due to his father's alleged transfer to Australia. There was still Thomas to account for. On the same Monday, April 4th, Xavier met up with Thomas, having dinner with him at a restaurant near his university residence. After the meal, a tired Thomas returned to his room. Thomas received an urgent message from his father the following day, claiming Agnes was in a hospital after a bicycle accident and was in a mild coma. This prompted Thomas to travel immediately. However, it is presumed that Xavier had already killed Thomas, just like he did with his siblings and mother. Later that evening, Emmanuel had a 19-minute conversation with Xavier. At midnight, a friend of Thomas received a message from him, stating he was watching a movie with his father at home. But by then, Thomas was likely already dead. About an hour later, Xavier sent an email to Emmanuel, arranging to meet soon. Emmanuel replied, reminding Xavier that he had power of attorney and that the key was on the sailboat. Instead of trying to hide, Xavier went about his daily routine, going in and out of his house, leaving notes on the door and withdrawing cash from ATMs. He used his credit cards to pay for meals at restaurants and stayed in hotels under his real name, all while being caught on security cameras. As time passed, neighbors began to notice something was off. The usually open windows of the chalet were closed. The family's 4 children were no longer seen. The dogs had stopped barking and Agnes hadn't returned to work. It was as if the family had vanished into thin air. Piecing together the strange signs, worried neighbors alerted the authorities. When officers arrived, they found a nearly bare refrigerator containing only a few jars of preserves. In the kitchen, they discovered a still damp mop, and in the living room, a chest sat on the table and guitars lay on the sofa. It seemed as though the Dupont de Leon family had vanished into thin air. The scene was unsettling, with beds stripped of their sheets, picture frames empty and closets devoid of clothes. Everything hinted at a sudden and mysterious departure. A few days later, on April 9th, a letter emerged, sent to family and friends. The letter claimed that Xavier had been recruited by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration and that the family had to go into hiding as part of a witness protection program, explaining their sudden disappearance and silence. However, neighbors were skeptical about this story, feeling that something wasn't quite right. They feared for the family's safety and urged the authorities to dig deeper. Xavier drove through southern France in his car as the case continued to attract media attention, leading to the emergence of more details from the past. On April 15th, security cameras recorded Xavier checking into a small hotel near Cannes, where he parked his car, grabbed a bag and vanished into the nearby woods, marking the last time he was seen. Emmanuel made a surprising call to his mom, revealing secrets like his homosexuality, alcoholism, and depression. When cops searched the house again, they found a freshly disturbed patch of earth. After investigating, they discovered a concrete slab leading to a grim find. Agnes and her 4 kids shot and wrapped in bags with religious symbols, buried in burlap sacks with quicklime, along with the family dogs. In the master bedroom, a sleep apnea device was found, last recording at 3:27 a.m. on April 4th. Xavier may have spared Thomas due to his bond with Emmanuel. However, when questioned, Emmanuel's cooperative facade cracked, revealing inconsistencies in his story. 24 hours later, Nantes police searched Emmanuel's apartment, seizing his laptop. He then revealed his knowledge of Xavier's rifle. An examination of the hard drive uncovered emails between Emmanuel and Xavier, including one from April 6th that raised suspicions. Investigators began to suspect Emmanuel's involvement in Xavier's escape. Christine and JVV also faced scrutiny for their evasive answers about Xavier and the Church of Philadelphia. JVV dodged questions about Xavier's childhood and the sex income, denying its existence. But investigators found a complaint from former members who fled after Christine's proposal to conceive a chosen one through group sex. This revealed the sex workings, including rich backers. Suspecting support for Xavier, police questioned former members and watched the sex followers, but found no leads. Authorities tracked Xavier's movements via cell phone records, last sighting April 15th, possibly carrying a weapon. Despite searches, no body remains found. Speculation rescued by boat taken to another country. International arrest warrant issued May 4th. Police investigated boat ownership but found nothing. On May 9th, Emmanuel was summoned to the Nantes police station for another interview, which had escalated into a grueling interrogation. The police had shifted their focus to finding a sailboat and identifying its captain. But Emmanuel was still oblivious to the magnitude of the investigation or the mounting suspicions against him. When questioned about a sailboat reference, he attributed it to coincidence, explaining that he had granted Xavier power of attorney to access his safe deposit box in case of an emergency. The key, he revealed, was hidden on a model sailboat in an apartment, and the safe contained only his will. The police, still frustrated and empty-handed despite the intriguing coincidences, ultimately released Emmanuel. At this point, the investigation remained shrouded in uncertainty. Emmanuel was viewed as a witness with no arrests made, and police questioned the need to further interrogate him. However, they decided to apply pressure, given his credibility as an accomplice. A notable detail emerged when investigators found an unusual $4,200 check signed by Emmanuel linked to a previously unknown Monaco account. Authorities requested account statements, but faced resistance due to Monaco's strict banking privacy laws. September 28th, four police officers resetted Emmanuel's home. He emerged disoriented, in underwear, barely confirming his identity. His sparse apartment was cluttered with empty bottles, revealing deep loneliness. Emmanuel was tormented by the lack of letters or calls from his friend. The police now viewed him as a lost soul, not a suspect, wondering if they'd followed the wrong lead. Xavier had become one of France's most wanted alleged murderers, possibly even globally renowned. In 2015, a journalist claimed to have received a letter from Xavier, stating he was alive, but the handwriting, DNA, and fingerprint analyses failed to yield any clues of evidence. On January 9, 2018, police raided a monastery in Rab-Brunsererin following a tip-off about a monk resembling Xavier, but after an intense 2-hour search, they determined it was a case of mistaken identity. On January 18, 2019, Angel died of a heart attack. And that same year, authorities arrested a man they believed to be Xavier at Glasgow Airport in Scotland. But once again, it proved to be a case of mistaken identity. Another theory proposes that Xavier might be hiding in South America, specifically Argentina, where his linguistic skills and charisma would enable him to seamlessly blend in. Years have passed, and the Church of Philadelphia has not only endured, but reportedly undergone a resurgence. This small, highly secretive group consists of members who have been part of it for nearly 40 years, living as if they have withdrawn from the world. In the summer of 2019, two brothers who were raised within the sect filed new complaints against Christine and GV, claiming that these women fervently preached that Xavier was alive, innocent, and hiding in the United States as part of a witness protection program. They allege that everything written in the April 9th letter was pure fabrication. Since 2011, the case has been plagued by speculation and false leads, leading authorities down endless dead ends. The pressing question remains, will justice ever be served for Agnes and her children? Despite the bleak outlook, some still believe that the truth will eventually come to light. On January 15, 2018, Louise Porton dialed the 999 emergency contact number, reporting that her 3-year-old daughter, Lexi Draper, was unconscious and not breathing. Despite the urgency of the situation, when the paramedics arrived, Louise's demeanor was unsettlingly calm. As they rushed to assist Lexi, they were met with a chilling sight. A lifeless body, her skin tinged blue and her jaw clenched tightly shut. Despite their desperate efforts, it was too late. The 3-year-old was pronounced dead at the scene, but the tragedy didn't end there. Just 18 days later, Louise made another call, this time to the 111 non-emergency number, reporting that her 17-month-old daughter, Scarlett Vaughn, wasn't breathing. In an extreme situation like this, why did Porton call 111, which is a non-emergency number, instead of 999? Did she think the numbers were the same? Or was there something more sinister behind her actions? The deaths of both children cast suspicion on Louise, prompting a closer look at her background. As investigators delved deeper, Louise's past began to reveal a darker side. Louise Porton was born in 1996 in the town of Walsall, located outside Birmingham in the UK. She grew up with her mother, Porton, and 2 siblings. From a young age, even as a child, Louise's behavior was a challenge for her family. While her family was close-knit, Louise often stood apart, displaying manipulative and cunning tendencies. She would often lie to her parents and try to manipulate her siblings and cousins, getting them into trouble. Notably, Louise displayed violent behavior towards her siblings and cousins, threatening them physically on multiple occasions. As she grew older, Louise's relationship with her family deteriorated further, especially with her mother. Her mother's affair and departure when Louise was a teenager had deepened her animosity towards her. Despite her siblings maintaining contact with their mother, Louise had cut ties completely. During her teenage years, Louise's behavior continued to worsen. She frequently clashed with her family, neglected school, and even got into trouble with the police. It's reported that she engaged in theft and displayed selfish and cold behavior. Additionally, Louise's apparent promiscuity became a significant issue. She sought attention from men, often using physical intimacy as a means to gain gifts and money. This behavior continued into her adulthood, where she extended it to online platforms, engaging with numerous men in exchange for gifts and money. Alongside this, Louise was also active online, posting photos to attract attention from men. She engaged in various forms of cosplay, dressing up in different costumes and sending out photos in exchange for payments or gifts. Over time, her photos became more revealing and she began claiming to be a model. Louise signed up with several model agencies, including one called Purple Port. However, the legitimacy of Purple Port is questionable, as some online reports suggest it may be used for exploitative purposes. Despite potential risks, Louise pursued modeling opportunities and offered intimate services to photographers for money. In addition to her modeling endeavors, Louise became a mother in late 2014 at the age of 18, giving birth to her first daughter, Lexi. However, she did not settle down and continued her lifestyle. Despite being a mother, Louise also had a strained relationship with Lexi's father, Chris Draper. Louise also had conflicts with her family, which were aggravated by her online behavior and refusal to prioritize her daughter's well-being. When her grandmother passed away, Louise's refusal to visit or attend the funeral led to further estrangement from her family. Despite these issues, Louise had another child, Scarlett, at the age of 20 with the same father as Lexi. As the children grew, Louise's actions became increasingly concerning. She spent hours every day on dating apps and websites seeking casual encounters and making money from these relationships. Louise would frequently leave her children with others or alone at home under the care of her landlady while she went out to meet strangers. This was to the point where the children spent more time with the landlady than with their own mother. In some cases, she even brought these men back to her home, putting her children in danger. Family members and acquaintances had grown increasingly worried about the safety and welfare of Lexi and Scarlett. They had reported Louise to social services, but no action was taken. The situation worsened as Louise began to view her children as a burden in her life, particularly when it came to her physical exploits. As Louise's life continued to spiral out of control, her relationship with her children's father, Chris Draper, remained strained. She even refused to allow him any contact with Lexi and Scarlett, going as far as giving Scarlett a different last name, Vaughn. This situation had taken a dark turn when Louise decided to move the family to Skidad Rugby, an hour away from Chris, effectively cutting him off from his children. Louise's sister Karen Porton had also tried to extend help and offer support whenever she could. However, Louise's priorities remained skewed. Many of the men she interacted with were clearly not suitable, with one even referring to her children as babies. Family members continued to express their worries to Louise, but she dismissed their concerns and even made light of the situation. Many had speculated that Louise might have given her children sedative medications to keep them unconscious, while she pursued her own interests. In the following months in 2017, this negligence and abuse took a toll on Lexi and Scarlett, who were left to fend for themselves in their mother's absence. As Louise's relationship with her children deteriorated, so did her mental state. She became more aggressive and verbally abusive, lashing out at her children at the slightest provocations. On multiple occasions, she repeatedly subjected Lexi and Scarlett to physical violence, beating them to manipulate their actions and silence their cries. Social services continued to fail to intervene, leaving Louise free to continue her destructive path. As Louise continued to be consumed by her own desires and unable to cope with the responsibilities of motherhood, she had reached a grim decision and had devised a plan to rid herself of the burden her children had become. On January 2, 2018, Louise reached out to her sister, expressing worry about Lexi experiencing a fit. However, Louise only made the call after Lexi's condition had significantly worsened. This carelessness continued even after Lexi was discharged from the hospital, with Louise focusing more on her dating activities than her daughter's health. Meanwhile, Louise's Google searches showed a darker truth to the investigators. She had searched about suffocation, breathlessness in children, and how it might lead to death. And slowly, the investigators came to realize that her Google searches were not driven by genuine concern, but rather a more sinister motive. Tragically, just 2 days later, on January 4, 2018, Lexi fell seriously ill, and Louise called 999, claiming her daughter had stopped breathing. However, her emotionless demeanor during the call had raised further doubts about her sincerity. When paramedics arrived, they found Lexi in a critical condition with her lips, fingers, and eyes turning blue. It was evident that she had been in that state for a prolonged period before Louise had finally called for help, exposing the extent of Louise's neglect and indifference towards her daughter's life. Paramedics couldn't comprehend how a healthy child like Lexi could suddenly experience 2 life-threatening incidents within such a short period. During Lexi's 4-day hospital stay, Louise remained at the hospital, using the opportunity to send messages and explicit photos of herself to men and even flirt with hospital staff. After Lexi was discharged, the doctors could only conclude that a possible chest infection might have caused her symptoms. Lexi was brought back home, and Louise's actions continued to be callous and manipulative. CCTV footage from the hotel showed Louise and the kids returning home from the hospital, and her attitude even at this time clearly showed that she had no interest in caring for her children. She exploited her daughter's health issues to solicit money from men, claiming she needed financial assistance to care for Lexi. Louise's Google searches also became increasingly concerning as she looked up methods of self-harming and information about resuscitation and death. It became evident that she was researching ways to kill her daughter while making it appear as an accident. Investigators had gone through the searches she made on January 2nd and 4th, and over time, Louise's Google searches became more specific, focusing on the timing of calling emergency services after causing a person's death. She had even searched how long a body would take to turn blue from suffocation. This revealed her intention to ensure that she could still dial 999 after murdering her daughter, but not so early that she could be revived. Despite her heinous intentions, Louise continued to deceive men by fabricating her daughter's health condition, claiming that she was dying from a deadly flu. It seemed that her lack of empathy and the extent to which she was willing to manipulate others for her own twisted purposes knew no bounds. On January 14, 2018, the tragic incident unfolded when Lexi and Scarlett had visited Louise's sister, Karen. After returning home at 6 p.m., Lexi's health suddenly deteriorated again. Louise called 999, claiming her daughter was unconscious and not breathing. When paramedics arrived, they found Lexi unresponsive, with signs of rigor mortis, indicating she had likely been dead for several hours before the emergency call. Despite their best efforts, Lexi was pronounced dead at the scene. Despite the heartbreaking loss of her daughter, Louise continued her manipulative behavior. It was found out that she had accepted 41 friend requests on her dating app the very next day and exploited Lexi's death to solicit money from men. She even set up a GoFundMe account for her daughter's funeral, potentially using the donations for her personal gain. Her insincere Facebook post about Lexi further highlighted her lack of genuine grief. In the days following Lexi's death, Louise was seen laughing and joking with friends, even at her daughter's funeral. But this didn't stop there. Scarlett wasn't any different from Lexi to her mother and was also a burden to her. At the funeral, Louise's mother appeared in her life after Lexi's death, offering to help plan the funeral. Concerned, Louise allegedly mentioned that Scarlett might meet the same fate as Lexi, but no one reported her suspicious behavior to the authorities. On February 1st, just 18 days later, her words came true. Louise and Scarlett stayed in a hotel room, and despite Scarlett being healthy, her condition suddenly deteriorated. Louise messaged the men she was seeing, asking for £30 to cover petrol costs for taking Scarlett to the hospital. These men urged her to call an ambulance, but Louise only wanted attention and money. At 9:50 p.m., Louise left the hotel with Scarlett, but she didn't rush to the hospital. Instead, she drove around town taking her time and acting nonchalant, as if her daughter's life wasn't in danger. Surveillance footage at traffic stops at Hill Morton showed her driving around the city with no intention of reaching out to the helplines. She pulled into a gas station where surveillance cameras caught her. In the footage, we can see Louise taking her sweet time with her daughter fighting at death's door in the car. No concern or urgency can be seen in her face or behavior. Eventually, 30 minutes later, she pulled into a shopping center where she dialed 111. For people outside the UK, 111 is the non-emergency helpline while 999 is the emergency helpline number. And she still chose to dial 111. By the time the paramedics arrived, Scarlett was found dead and lifeless. It was again discovered that the child had been dead for a few hours before Louise had called for help. The doctors found that the death was consistent with deliberate airway obstruction, and Louise again showed little concern at the sudden and unexplained death. Doctors could not find any natural reason why either of the children would have died in such a manner. Meanwhile, when asked by the paramedics, Louise claimed that Scarlett had the flu. In both Lexi and Scarlett's cases, forensic experts conducted extensive post-mortem examinations. It was revealed that their deaths were intentional and not accidents. Lexi died from the deliberate obstruction of her airways. Examiners had found marks on her nose, indicating her nose was held shut, and she had scratch marks on her neck, suggesting she was fighting her mother's hands as Louise suffocated her. In Scarlett's case, the 17-month-old died from the obstruction of her airways as well. She had bruising around her neck and head, damage to her neck muscles, and bleeding in her lungs. Some of Scarlett's blood was also found on the pillow of the hotel room where she had died. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Louise had never admitted to her actions or shown remorse. Although there was not enough evidence to formally arrest her at the time, investigators continued to pursue the case, knowing that Louise was responsible for the murders of these innocent children. So nearly a year later, in January 2019, police finally gathered enough evidence to bring charges against her for the murders of her 2 children. And on the 20th of March 2019, Louise was arrested. In August of 2019, her trial began, and she pleaded not guilty. Overwhelming evidence was presented against her, including her chat history on dating apps, her neglectful behavior towards her children, and the results of the post-mortem examinations. On August 3, 2019, the jury found her guilty. Louise Porton was ultimately sentenced to 32 years in prison. However, many believe this sentence is insufficient, considering her young age at the time of sentencing, being only 23 years old. There are concerns that she might be released early if she behaves well in prison. During the trial, she showed no remorse and was emotionless. She just stood there without any guilt for murdering her own children. While speculations abound, the motive behind Louise's actions remains unclear. Despite undergoing a mental health assessment, no diagnoses were made, and she was deemed to be of sound mind at the time of the murders. The prevailing theory is that Louise saw her children as burdens, especially in relation to her immoral life, and thus decided to eliminate them. The aftermath of this case left everyone connected to it devastated. Louise's mother, Sharon Porton, fell into a deep depression, feeling she could have done more to help her 2 young granddaughters. Tragically, on February 4, 2020, she was found dead in her residence, having taken her own life at the age of 40. Also, the girl's father, Chris, experienced intense anguish. He expressed regret and frustration, feeling he could have done more to pursue custody when the opportunity arose. Now, the sorrow of never having met his 17-month-old daughter, Scarlett, consumes his every thought, even 18 months after the girls' deaths. In remembrance of the victims, Lexi Draper and Scarlett Vaughn are described as 2 sweet girls with infectious smiles and vibrant personalities. A white horse-drawn carriage adorned with purple was arranged to transport them to their final resting place. Their untimely deaths cut short lives that held endless promise. Kalamazoo County, Michigan. In the vibrant landscape of the 1990s, Kalamazoo County, Michigan was a place where hard work, strong relationships, and a shared commitment to progress defined the way of life. As of that period, the population of Kalamazoo County, Michigan stood at 223,411. It was a melting pot of people with different aspirations. Against the backdrop of this dynamic county, the 1990s unfolded as a transformative decade with one crime defining its history. The fateful day was November 17, 1990, a rather warm day in Kalamazoo County. A group of hunters were on their way to catch a good game in the Fulton State Game area. Among them were Bobby Brown and his stepfather, Doug Estes. The group decided to split up and thought that it was a good strategy going in different directions. Doug, Bobby, and others were focused on hearing even the slightest of sounds to detect the deer's movement. Winter days were often quiet, so when the sound of 2 gunshots echoed, it caught the attention of the group and the nearby residents. Just a few minutes after it, Helen Knops, a local resident, and her son heard a car screech off into a ditch just down the road from her house. Was this a coincidence, or could it be related to the shots that were recently fired? The timing and proximity could not have been a coincidence, but the fact remained that gunshots were not unusual in the area. Concerned and curious, Knops and her son approached the car and saw a man behind the steering wheel. Covered in sweat, he seemed nervous, and the look on his face was plain unfriendly. Knops thought he needed help, so she offered to call a tow truck for him, but he refused. saying that he ended up in the ditch because a deer had suddenly appeared and crossed the road. While the reason seemed genuine, after all, people used to come here and hunt deer, there was something amiss. He seemed to be in a hurry to leave, and Knops thought he was pretending to be calm, which was odd. She offered to call the police, but the man in the car was not at all seeking any help. He expressed disinterest in involving law enforcement, confident that someone else would fix his car, and just like that he drove away. But the echoes of the gunshots were still fresh. Bobby Brown thought that his stepfather had caught the deer because the sound came from the direction he went. Almost excited to congratulate him, he went on in the same direction and found Doug lying on his back on the ground in a pool of blood. The direction that Doug was hunting, I assumed he got a deer, so I decided I'd slowly walk back up. It was such an unusual sight that the first thought Bobby could muster was if it was a prank that Doug was trying to play. As reality sunk in, he could not believe what he was looking at. But there had been 2 gunshots. Could have meant that Doug was shot twice, however, he had only 1 bullet wound. The other possibility was that someone really tried killing him by firing 2 simultaneous shots and missed one. But when Bobby looked around in a frantic state, his eyes landed on another thing that he could not believe. There was another body lying face down. He checked for Doug's pulse first, but there was no hope. So he quickly ran over to the other man's body and rolled him over. But he was clearly dead. There was nothing Bobby could do. He ran off to ask for some help and quickly informed the police. The stage was set for a thorough investigation by the police, who arrived promptly to scrutinize the unsettling events that unfolded on that fateful day. The officers confirmed the presence of the 2 bodies that Bobby had already informed them about. The first job at their hands was to identify the victims, and soon enough the police knew who they were. Since Bobby had called the police, he had already identified his stepfather, Doug, and the other man was Jim Bennett, was a nature lover and was on a solo hunt that day. Both Doug Estes and Jim Bennett were hid in the back at close range through their hunting licenses. The weird thing was that the men had been shot using different firearms. One theory was that they had shot each other somehow, mistaking each other as the deer they had been looking for. The first issue was that both of them had been shot in the back, so it was almost impossible for them to hit the mark. And the second inconsistency arose when ballistic tests showed that Jim's muzzleloader was fully loaded and Doug's gun was nowhere to be found at the site. But that was only the first stage of confusion. The case was assigned to now retired Detective Bruce Wiersma and Sergeant Roy Bowlett. Wiersma was overwhelmed by it as he was not experienced in homicide cases, let alone double homicide. The area had not even witnessed murder cases in a long time. However, Wiersma decided to be thorough with the details to ensure a proper procedure. As the investigation proceeded, they found out that Doug and Jim were strangers to each other. They had gone out to hunt separately, and it was only a coincidence that they were both killed at the same time. The detectives were already clueless. What could have been the motive of the kill? Had the victims been acquaintances, a mutual friend could have been identified. But now that there was no connection between them, it was all the more difficult to understand the case. But all hope was not lost, as their suspicions started building on Bobby Brown, the stepson of one of the victims. The detectives initially believed that the killings occurred because the target was Jim. According to them, Bobby had planned to rob him, but the robbery went wrong, and somewhere along the way, Doug was killed too. The police suspected that since Bobby's plan did not work, he had to call the police. Both Estes and Bennett's family believed that their loved one was not the main target, and Bobby's intentions and motives did not line up with the crime. No matter what the family said, the detective's suspicion radar was on alert to look for any evidence that they had missed earlier. The police decided to search the crime site again and asked the neighbors if they heard or saw something suspicious that day. Sure enough, the neighbors had heard the gunshots, but the testimony given by Helen Knops provided a new angle to the story. She helped the officers create a composite sketch of the man whose car landed in the ditch. The mystery man was becoming a suspect, but there was no way to link him to the crime. So the detectives proceeded to talk to other neighbors. After thoroughly conversing with them and delving into their accounts, a new name emerged from the shadows: Jeff Titus. Born in 1952, Jeff Titus was the owner of the property right behind the Fulton State Game area, where it shared a boundary. He served as a police officer in the U.S. Marine Corps and later worked in the security detail for President Richard Nixon. Later, he found employment as a security guard at a VA medical center. Alongside his professional pursuits, he enjoyed hunting and spending time outdoors, but he was protective of his property. He used to get mad when hunters used to wander into his estates. So, could Doug and Jim have angered Titus by crossing the border into his place? The question on the detectives' minds was, where was Titus at the time of the murder? When he was available in the evening of the same day, the detectives took him in for interrogation. As it turned out, Jeff Titus was on a deer hunting trip himself. He had gone off with a friend to an area near Battle Creek, more than 27 miles away from the Fulton Game State area at the property of an elderly couple. After several hours, Titus and his friend went to Burger King and drove back home. That was the moment when the story started mixing up. The missing gun that belonged to Doug Estes had finally been found fully loaded. It was with Titus. He said that he had found it about 30 yards away from the crime scene and thought to keep it after wiping it clean, so it could not be traced to someone else and no one could claim it. Although the discovery put Titus under the threat of a major suspicion, it proved that Doug and Jim hadn't killed each other, and someone else was responsible for their death. It definitely raised suspicions, but there was no way to prove if Titus' story was fake. And the most important fact was that he had a rock-solid alibi, so he was cleared. But the detectives knew something was not right. No matter how much they tried, the case seemed to get even more twisted. Ultimately, with no further leads or clues, the case went cold. In the year 2000, the double homicide case of Doug and Jim was reopened, and the case files were transferred to a new team of detectives led by now retired Sergeant Mike Workema and Detective Mike Brown. They started their investigation of the case by revisiting the neighbors, rechecking the clues, and reconsidering the old suspects. And sure enough, their initial suspicion landed on Bobby Brown. After a lot of back and forth, he was cleared. So, if there were no leads and clues, and the main suspect was cleared, who had killed those men that day? It seemed like a simple answer in hindsight, but the cold case detectives took their time and finally decided that no matter what the initial officers believed, the killer had to be Jeff Titus. More than a decade had passed since the crime. The memories of the people were foggy, and their statements were different. It was proving to be more difficult than they had expected. However, the detectives soon came up with a plausible theory. It suggested that, on November 17, 1990, the day of the murders, Titus had departed from the hunting property he was initially, and returned to his own adjoining property near the Fulton State Game area. This action was driven by his suspicion that unauthorized individuals might have trespassed onto his land. Subsequently, it was believed that he perpetrated the killings, before making his way back to the property in the Battle Creek area and returning home with his friend. In 2001, Titus, a married man and a father, found himself under arrest following reports from his co-workers at the Veterans Affairs Hospital. They disclosed the same thing, that Titus disliked trespassing hunters during the deer hunting season. According to the detectives, it was a good enough motive. Moreover, his co-workers also alleged that he openly discussed and boasted about the killings. The trial of Jeff Titus was conducted in 2002, led by the now retired Kalamazoo County Assistant Prosecutor Scott Brower. Unfortunately, the passage of time had taken a toll on Titus' alibi witnesses, rendering them unable to provide a testimony in his favor. His neighbor, Helen Knops, came to the witness stand, but nothing about the mystery man in his car came up, and the original investigators who had thoroughly cleared Titus of any wrongdoing were not summoned to testify during the trial. So despite the prosecutors not contesting the credibility of Titus' alibi, he was convicted and sentenced to 2 life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. He was incarcerated at Lakeland Correctional Facility in Coldwater, Michigan. But this story was far from over. During Titus' legal defense, led by attorney William Fett, a notable addition to the team was Howard Swabash, a recently retired polygraph examiner from the Michigan State Police. It was revealed that Swabash had been hired as a private investigator by FET. The court records indicated that Swabash's wife initiated divorce proceedings in January 2002, merely 5 weeks after Titus was charged with murder. The allegations of marital infidelity caused the marital breakdown of their marriage, although the identity of the other woman involved was kept hidden. On the eventful Halloween day of October 31, 2002, 3 months after Titus' conviction by a jury, his wife Julie paid him a visit at Saginaw Prison, accompanied by their daughter and the private investigator Swabash. Julie informed Titus that she intended to file for divorce, as they had not gotten along for years. The public records indicated that Swabash and Titus' ex-wife Julie eventually married in Florida in April 2005, merely 3 years after Titus' conviction, marking a surprising turn of events that raised questions about their connection and its potential impact on the case. Retired Sergeant Roy Ballett, who served with the Kalamazoo County Sheriff's Office, played a significant role in the initial investigation that led to Titus being cleared of suspicion in 1990. Ballett, feeling perplexed and dissatisfied with the course of events, confronted Swabash, the investigator. at Kalamazoo County Courthouse shortly after Titus' conviction. Ballard expressed his disappointment, questioning why Swabash had not even bothered to contact him to discuss his insights and sentiments regarding the case, particularly if he had taken on the role of investigating to establish Titus' innocence. Neither Ballard nor the other original detective was called as witnesses by the defense. They would have provided crucial testimony regarding Titus' alibi. The confrontation grew heated, with Swabash responding in a confrontational manner and using inappropriate language. He abruptly departed, leaving Ballard to reflect on the encounter. In an interview conducted over the phone from prison, Titus openly wondered if this defense team's private investigator had been truly committed to serving his interests. He said, "It's a shocker. And then I wonder, was he working for me? Was he working for an ulterior motive? I don't know." Titus consistently maintained his innocence throughout the entire course of events. However, it was a pivotal moment when Bruce Weirsamer and Roy Ballett, the two detectives involved in the initial investigation, made a public announcement, expressing their willingness to testify in support of Titus' alibi. This development caught the attention of the Innocence Clinic at the University of Michigan, prompting their involvement in the case. Simultaneously, the Michigan Attorney General's office initiated its own independent investigation. As both entities delved into the evidence, a significant revelation emerged. They found that there were several other hunter killings in the area, and it seemed like the work of a serial killer, a crucial detail that had not been disclosed to Titus' defense team during the original trial in 2002. Without any doubt, it raised doubts about any potential connection between Titus and the tragic deaths of Doug and Jim. These findings, coupled with other compelling evidence, prompted the Innocence Clinic to file a motion for a relief of judgment and a new trial on Titus' behalf. But the real turning point came in 2019, when Jacinda Davis, a 47-year-old esteemed producer renowned for her work in the true crime genre, stumbled upon her most captivating story. As she traveled the roads in search of inspiration for her upcoming series, The Killer in Question, her path led her to the heart of Michigan, drawn by the allure of Jack White's famed Third Man Records. Amidst her online exploration, a fascinating case of Jeff Titus caught her attention. Davis's journey intersected with that of Susan Simpson, a 34-year-old former attorney-turned-podcaster. Simpson, together with Rabia Chaudhry and Colin Miller, were the hosts of the acclaimed podcast Undisclosed. They met, talked together, discussed, and finally, Davis and Simpson found themselves embarking on a collaborative endeavor, uniting their narrative prowess to shed light on the enigmatic Titus case. The forthcoming season of Undisclosed, Simpson's podcast, was scheduled to be released on October 26, 2020. After it was aired, the audience was able to delve deep into the intricate details surrounding the controversial conviction and learn some things that were earlier shrouded in mystery. Simultaneously, on November 1, 2020, viewers tuned in to the debut episode of Killer in Question, a compelling 2-hour documentary that aired on Investigation Discovery. While researching for their podcast and the series, Davis and Simpson found that something in the story did not sit right. Davis said, "I can't think of another case where there are two sets of detectives that don't agree. The original detectives in this case absolutely, 100% cleared Jeff Titus and believe he is not guilty. And the cold case team is the opposite. They believe beyond a doubt that they have the right man." During their extensive investigation, they uncovered a significant breakthrough involving two crucial witnesses who had observed a car stuck in a ditch immediately following the gunshots. The fact that Helen Knops, a neighbor of Titus, could have easily identified Titus if he was in the car, raised more questions. Since the driver turned out not to be him, it left them wondering about the stranger's true intentions and why he was in such a frantic rush to flee the scene. Could he be the elusive murderer they were seeking? To their surprise, the composite sketch that was generated based on Knops' testimony closely resembled Thomas Dillon, a notorious serial killer active in Ohio. Dillon had a history of targeting hunters, fishermen, and outdoor enthusiasts. In fact, according to FBI reports, Knops herself had even identified him from a police lineup when he was eventually apprehended in 1993 for the murders of other hunters. Filled with hope, both Simpson and Davis believed that their stories would encourage individuals with crucial information about the Estes and Bennett murders to step forward. As Simpson pointed out, the mere act of sharing these narratives often leads to a ripple effect, prompting individuals to come forward with valuable insights that can be incorporated into the ongoing investigation. Davis shared their sentiment, believing that people hold untold stories within them. She acknowledged that memories may change over time, with small details sometimes fading away. However, original recollections tend to endure. Naturally, As they delved deeper into the case, both investigators began forming their own opinions regarding Titus' guilt. Simpson, initially unimpressed by the evidence, discovered compelling corroborations that aligned with the initial conclusions of the case's original investigators. The evidence against Jeff Titus simply did not hold up. Since 2019, Titus' case has undergone comprehensive review by the Conviction Integrity Unit within the Michigan State Attorney General's office. As the investigation into this possible wrongful conviction continued, none of the motions submitted by the Innocence Clinic had been granted, leaving Jeff Titus behind bars at the Lakeland Correctional Facility in Coldwater Branch County, Michigan, where he had to serve 2 life sentences. In the face of adversity, the Innocence Clinic made efforts in 2021 to secure Titus' release from the facility due to the COVID-19 outbreak. With a significant number of inmates at Lakeland testing positive for the virus, they sought an exceptional circumstance release on bond. Unfortunately, their plea was administered by a district judge who deemed it unwarranted. Davis and Simpson, the podcasters, were the initial sleuths who stumbled upon a potential link between the 1990 murders and the serial killer Dylan. Their investigative instincts led them to uncover Dylan's dark past, as he had confessed to the chilling murders of 5 hunters and outdoorsmen in Ohio back in 1993. Additionally, Dylan had been a prime suspect in another killing in Pennsylvania and divulged to his cellmate about his involvement in the deaths of 2 hunters in a county that he believed law enforcement would never tie to him. Although Dylan met his demise in prison on October 21, 2011, his connection to the case presented a compelling lead. Driven by their determination, Michigan Innocence Clinic Director David Moran embarked on a mission, making his way to the Kalamazoo County Sheriff's Office. Moran dedicated an arduous 6 hours meticulously sifting through the archives of the file room. With each document examined, the puzzle pieces began to align, shedding light on a potentially significant breakthrough in the investigation. As Moran continued his search for the truth, he unexpectedly found a special folder hidden deep in the archive. The folder was thin and held around 30 interesting pages. On the outside, it had the words "serial killer" written lightly in pencil. As Moran read through the pages, he became more and more convinced. These documents contained valuable information about Dylan and could be the key to their success in solving the case. What added another layer of astonishment was the realization that these vital documents had never been disclosed to the defense. It appeared that the prosecutor's office remained oblivious to their existence, leaving an unsettling gap in the knowledge presented during the trial. This discovery ignited a spark of hope within Moran, fueling his belief that their pursuit of justice was on the path to victory. According to Bruce Wiersma, the original detective who compiled the serial killer file, the reports concerning Dylan were included in the case file, and he strongly believed that Dylan was the perpetrator behind the crimes. On the other hand, Mike Workema, the retired cold case sergeant, stated that he never came across that particular file. He and other detectives on the cold case team claimed to be unaware of the alternate suspect. However, a police report surfaced among court documents indicating that at least one of the cold case detectives had knowledge of the file. Stuart Fenton, a former Kalamazoo County assistant prosecutor, held a different perspective. He expressed his belief that Titus was responsible for the murders. He firmly believed that the jury made the correct decision and that an innocent man was not wrongfully convicted. In light of the recent allegations, Fenton opined that the newfound information would unlikely have altered the outcome of the original trial. During his time in prison, Titus made a personal vow not to trim his beard until the day he regained his freedom. When the long-awaited call finally came on February 16, 2023, informing him of his impending release, overwhelming emotions flooded over him. "I just started bawling," Titus recalled. Moments later, as he resumed his work on the cards, tears of joy would often well up again, prompting him to momentarily bury his face in his hands. However, Kalamazoo County Prosecutor Jeff Giddings said that a decision has not been made about if new charges will be filed. He said, "We're in the process of reviewing the case. It is a complicated factual and legal analysis that will take some time to process." On February 24, 2023, 71-year-old Jeff Titus was released from prison after spending more than 2 decades in prison for Doug Estes and Jim Bennett's 1990 murder case. His conviction was overturned. Titus said that, "It's been 22 years waiting for this day, and it should have never happened in the first place. I'm just ecstatic and overjoyed to finally be out where I can get out and do something. I want to see my grandkids. I haven't seen them. I want to see them." The moment of liberation from prison brought a flood of emotions that Titus struggled to put into words. As he stepped out into the free world, he was met by a supportive group of individuals who had played pivotal roles in his fight for justice. Attorney Moran, along with dedicated students from the Michigan Innocence Clinic, investigative podcasters Jacinda Davis and Susan Simpson, and the sons of the late Detective Roy Ballett, all stood by Titus' side during his newfound freedom. Detective Ballett, a stalwart believer in Titus' innocence, had passed away in January 2022, but his unwavering support left a lasting impact. While the cold case detective, Workema, agreed with the judge's decision to release Titus from prison based on the lack of awareness regarding Dylan, he remained convinced of Titus' guilt. "I still believe Jeff Titus is the killer," Workema asserted. "Considering his character and the actions he took, I believe he is the perpetrator. He is a dangerous individual, and I have apprehensions about him. I hope that now that he has gained his freedom, he will use it responsibly and make the right choices." With his newfound freedom, Titus engaged in activities he was deprived of for 2 decades. He immersed himself in the company of cherished friends and family, indulging in the food he had long missed. During his absence, rediscovering the joys of life, he enjoyed being with his grandsons, whom he had never met before, and even secured his driver's license. He said, "I can't express enough how grateful I am to be free and have the freedom to simply live again." Titus delighted in feeding deer and songbirds, and his artistic spirit remained alive as he continued to design and draw greeting cards. After almost 2 decades, justice was finally served to Jeff Titus, but the case of Doug Estes and Jim Bennett remained a mystery after the death of the serial killer Thomas Dillon. Mitzi Sanchez was born on August 10, 1992 in Vallejo, California. She grew up in a large, close-knit family with 2 brothers and a sister. Mitzi was a cheerful and bright child. She enjoyed spending time outdoors with her friends and playing with her siblings. From a young age, Mitzi was quite independent. When she started elementary school, her parents allowed her to walk there with her brother without any adult supervision. The school was located just a short distance from their home, with most of the route lying along a busy road. August 10, 2000, was Mitzi's 8th birthday. She was excited about the celebration party her family had been preparing for her. Mitzi asked her mom if she could skip school for the occasion, but the woman said no. Mitzi was upset about it, and around 7:30 a.m. she left her home with her brother. After her classes, Mitzi was supposed to wait for her brother so they could walk home together. But when her brother went outside the school, he couldn't find his sister anywhere. Thinking she had already left without him, he headed home alone. But it turned out that Mitzi wasn't there. Their older sister, who was home at that time, immediately became worried. Since Mitzi was eagerly anticipating her birthday party, her absence seemed odd. She waited for some time, hoping that Mitzi would eventually show up, and around 4 p.m., the sister decided to call their mom and tell her about it. Their mom immediately called Mitzi's school and learned that her daughter had attended all her classes. The mother then reached out to family members and Mitzi's friends, but no one had seen her after school. Mitzi's relatives became worried and started searching for her. Many people, from family friends to neighbors, also joined in. Together, they quickly organized a massive search. While some of them walked the streets, others knocked on every door along the route, from the house to school, asking if anyone had seen her. They even started printing and distributing flyers with information about Mitzi. Despite all their efforts, they couldn't find her, so Mitzi's parents decided to call 911. The police immediately joined the search, and local media started covering the case on the same day. Mitzi's disappearance instantly captured the public's attention, since similar incidents had already occurred in their town before. For several years, an unknown perpetrator or multiple perpetrators had been kidnapping kids in Vallejo. The most recent case had occurred in December, less than a year before Mitzi's disappearance. 7-year-old Ziana Fairchild, who lived just a few miles from Mitzi's house, disappeared on her way to school. Despite all the efforts by the police and the FBI, she was never found. Now, when Mitzi vanished on her way home from school, investigators feared the same perpetrator might be involved. Despite the lack of leads at that point, the striking similarities between those cases were already obvious. However, Ziana's case remained unsolved, leaving detectives with little to go on. They began re-examining everyone previously considered a suspect in her case, but it yielded no results. The next day, Mitzi's disappearance made headlines not only in the local news, but statewide. Everyone feared a serial kidnapper was at large and dreaded the possibility of him getting away with it once again. Mitzi's relatives gave multiple interviews, trying to draw more attention to the case. Her mom also pleaded with a possible abductor to return her daughter safely. The police received numerous tips, but none of them proved useful. However, everything changed 24 hours after Mitzi's disappearance when something unexpected happened. A man contacted the police, informing them that he discovered bloodied rags at a landfill. Upon examination, experts determined that the rags were actually bed sheets from a Vallejo hotel. Although they sent the evidence to the lab, blood analysis would take days. Investigators also visited the hotel but were unable to confirm whether Mitzi had been there. With nothing but waiting for lab results, investigators combed the landfill, searching for any other clues, but it yielded nothing. The following day, August 12th, the police received another call, and it changed the course of this case immediately. At around 11 a.m., a man reported driving through an industrial area in Santa Clara when a little girl ran up to his van screaming that someone was chasing her. She climbed into the van's cabin and the driver saw a man running in their direction. The girl yelled that he had kidnapped her and wanted to kill her. As soon as she was in the van, the perpetrator turned around, got into his car, and fled. Meanwhile, the girl told the driver her name was Mitzi Sanchez, and he contacted the police. Officers immediately picked her up and drove her to a hospital for examination. They also called her mother and let her speak to her daughter. Soon after, her relatives rushed to the hospital and reunited with Mitzi. Meanwhile, detectives spoke with the van driver. The man proved a crucial lead. He remembered the license plate of the kidnapper's vehicle because it drove off right in front of his van. Turned out, the van driver was on that road almost by chance. He had a day off, but was asked by his supervisor to cover a shift and deliver a load. If he hadn't been there, the perpetrator possibly could have caught up with the girl. The police ran the license plate and identified the car belonging to a 39-year-old man named Curtis Dean Anderson. He had been on law enforcement's radar before with prior convictions for thefts, kidnapping, and suspicion of other crimes. As investigators focused all efforts on finding the abductor, their colleagues prepared to hear Mitzi's account of what had happened to her. She told them that on August 10th, she was eagerly awaiting the end of school to go home and celebrate her birthday with her family. When her final class ended, Mitzi decided not to wait for her brother and headed home alone. Just a few hundred yards away, she noticed a parked car by the roadside. Inside was a man, watching her intently through the rearview mirror. Mitzi felt uneasy about him, but quickly brushed it off. It was daytime, she was on a familiar street, and being young, she didn't fully grasp the potential danger posed by strangers. As Mitzi approached the car, the man got out and asked her to help him. He said he needed to grab a roll of tape from under the car seat. He also explained that he couldn't bend down himself due to a leg injury from falling off his bike. Despite her uneasy feeling, Mitzi agreed to help. At that time, she couldn't fully comprehend the potential danger posed by the adult man, and her parents had always taught her to help others. As soon as Mitzi reached for the tape, the perpetrator shoved her inside, covered her mouth with his hand, and slammed the door shut. Mitzi tried to scream, but it was too late. The kidnapper drove off in an unknown direction, leaving her to gaze out the window in horror. At one point, they passed Mitzi's home, and she saw her relatives preparing to celebrate her birthday. A few minutes later, the kidnapper pulled into a deserted parking lot. He gave Mitzi new clothes, forced her to change, and discarded her old clothing in a nearby trash bin. He also warned Mitzi not to try to escape, claiming he had a gun and that no one ever managed to get away from him. In the next few hours, he drove Mitzi in an unknown direction. At one point, she asked why he had kidnapped her, and the man simply replied that the same had happened to him when he was a child. When it got dark, he parked again and began covering the car windows with some rags. He then pulled out a chain and secured it to Mitzi's leg with a padlock. Then, the perpetrator took out a bottle of alcohol and forced her to take a few sips. Mitzi tried to argue with him, but eventually complied with his demand. After that, the man grabbed a camera and took several pictures of Mitzi, then lay down to sleep right in the car. Mitzi tried to keep her eyes open, afraid of falling asleep. She was thinking how to escape and at one point saw a police car drive the parking lot, but it was far away, and even if Mitzi had screamed, the officers would never have been able to hear her. The next day, the perpetrator continued driving her around the city. He made her sit on the floor of the car and covered her with sheets to hide her from view. At one point, he stopped and got out for a few minutes. Mitzi tried to free her leg from the chain, but quickly realized it was impossible. She also found a nail file and attempted to unlock the padlock, but it didn't work. When the perpetrator returned to the car and drove away, he claimed he had stopped by her parents' house. The kidnapper pretended to be a concerned citizen and asked for flyers to distribute around town. Mitzi was shocked and overwhelmed. She had been so close to home, yet still remained in captivity. Throughout the next few hours, the perpetrator stopped several times, getting in and out of the car. In the evening, he drove out of town and parked in a deserted area, where he sexually assaulted his victim. After that, the man fell asleep, leaving Mitzi in a state of shock. The next morning, he drove off again, making several stops along the way, mainly to buy cigarettes and alcohol. At one point, when he returned to the car and leaned into the cabin, something fell out of his pocket. He told Mitzi not to look there and left again. But the girl didn't listen to him. She glanced down and saw a large bunch of keys. Mitzi quickly realized that one of them must unlock the padlock on her chain. She was afraid of what the perpetrator might do to her if she disobeyed. But eventually, Mitzi overcame this fear. She grabbed the bunch, picked a key that seemed to fit the lock the best, and attempted to unlock it. To her surprise, it worked. Mitzi freed herself from the chain. Now only the car door stood between her and freedom. Mitzi opened the window and tried to climb out through it, but she encountered another problem. She was so exhausted that she could barely move her legs. Gathering all her strength, she managed to lift herself and leap out of the car. As she crawled around it, she spotted her kidnapper, who immediately noticed her. The man began shouting for her to come back, but Mitzi had no intention of giving up. With her last ounce of energy, she ran in the opposite direction. The perpetrator chased after her while Mitzi tried to flag down passing cars for help. She waved and screamed, but they all drove past. Despite this, Mitzi kept moving toward her freedom. She had no doubt that if she stopped for even a second, the perpetrator would catch up and harm her. Everything happened very quickly, but for Mitzi, this moment stretched on forever. Eventually, she spotted a van, ran towards it and jumped right in front of it. The driver quickly stopped and Mitzi climbed into the cabin. She was shocked, dehydrated and hungry, but her life was no longer in danger. At the hospital, doctors provided her with the necessary assistance, and soon her entire family arrived to reunite with her. Mitzi's miraculous rescue instantly became the main news story in the city. When she was brought home, thousands of people gathered on her street. They applauded her and shouted birthday greetings, which she had missed. Meanwhile, the police were hunting down the kidnapper, whose whereabouts remained unknown. When they showed his photo to Mitzi's mother, she realized she had actually seen him twice. The first time was before her daughter's abduction, when he stood on their street and looked towards their house. The second time was the day after Mitzi's disappearance, when the perpetrator came to her home and asked for flyers. The search for Curtis continued until late evening. Police set up surveillance at all known places he frequented, and eventually it paid off. He came to a trailer park and was apprehended without resistance. Curtis was booked in jail, awaiting trial, and detectives began investigating his possible connections to other crimes. The man himself told Mitzi she wasn't his first victim, and no one had managed to escape him. Investigators simply couldn't imagine this being his first crime of its kind. All his careful and likely premeditated actions suggested he had significant experience in committing such atrocities. It's worth mentioning that Curtis had been previously imprisoned for kidnapping a woman in 1991. He was released in November 1999, and now the police were confident that after his release, he had killed at least one girl, 7-year-old Ziana Fairchild, but we'll get back to that shortly. There was also no doubt that he intended to kill Mitzi. Moreover, one specific fact directly indicated that it was supposed to happen on the day of her escape. Police learned why Curtis had stopped in the industrial area. He used to work there at one of the companies, and that day he visited his former colleagues. He had asked them for a large bag, and detectives immediately realized he planned to dispose of a body in it. After Curtis's arrest, Mitzi struggled to recover for a long time. However, she soon learned that the police were suspecting him of kidnapping Ziana, which made her even more uneasy. While Mitzi was glad she managed to escape, she also worried about the fate of this 7-year-old girl. More than 8 months have passed since her disappearance, and there was no news about Ziana's fate. Mitzi wanted to help find her, so just days after her own rescue, she participated in a search operation along with other volunteers. Unfortunately, they couldn't find any new leads on Ziana's possible whereabouts. This continued until January 2001, when a human skull was found in the mountains near the city of Santa Cruz. Forensic analysis showed it belonged to Ziana, and she was officially declared dead. Mitzi took this news very hard, but ahead of her was another challenge: the trial. It began in April of the same year. Mitzi had to testify before the full courtroom and recount in every detail what Curtis had done to her. He was also present there. But despite all of this, Mitzi managed to fulfill her task. In the end, Curtis was sentenced to 251 years in prison. But that wasn't the end of his story. Detectives repeatedly visited him in jail and asked him questions about his possible involvement in other crimes. At one point, they learned that Curtis had confessed to a fellow inmate about kidnapping and killing 8 other girls. The inmate agreed to cooperate with the police and repeated Curtis' words in detail. But Curtis himself wasn't ready to reveal all his secrets. He didn't deny anything, but tried to negotiate various privileges for himself, speaking with detectives in riddles. Eventually, the man hinted that he had indeed murdered Ziana Fairchild and that he had killed at least 13 other girls and women. It wasn't until 2005 that he gave full confession in Ziana's murder, and for that, he received an additional 50-year sentence. As for Mitzi, her challenges didn't end with Curtis' trial. Just a few weeks after her rescue, she returned to school, where she faced bullying from other children. They called her the kidnapped girl, said she should have died instead of being saved, and generally behaved extremely inappropriately. As a result, her school years became a heavy burden for her, and along with the tragedy she had experienced, it didn't help in her recovery process. Mitzi also repeatedly joined the searches for other missing children, but more often than not, it ended with the discovery of their bodies. Each time, she felt this tragedy as if it were her own, and ultimately, she couldn't cope with this pressure anymore. Alcohol became her only way to cope with the stress, and with each passing day, Mitzi turned to it more and more frequently. Eventually, she stopped seeing even the slightest chance of returning to a normal life. But one day, everything changed. Mitzi was involved in a serious car accident after a party with friends. She broke her neck, arm, and spent 2 weeks in a coma. When she woke up, doctors informed her that she is pregnant and would have a daughter. This news turned her life upside down, and Mitzi found the strength to change it for the better once again. She decided to dedicate all her time, not only to her daughter, but also to other children who became victims of various crimes. She founded a non-profit organization that continues to provide assistance to those in need to this day. As for Curtis, he died of illness in February 2007, just 6 years after being sentenced. The only reason the detectives regretted it was the fact that they had not managed to obtain full confessions from him regarding other cases he was suspected of. Although they still haven't been solved, the police continue to consider his involvement highly probable. It is worth mentioning that Curtis had a son who followed in his father's footsteps. He was convicted of murder, and in 2019 his own life ended in prison. The case of Lorena Bobbitt. It's said that a humiliated and insulted woman is capable of anything, with the most terrifying in this list being revenge, cruel, ingenious, and sometimes unpredictable. Much in this regard depends on the lady's level of sanity, but one must not overlook the depth of her hurt. This destructive emotion can be carefully hidden within a woman for years, but if it erupts, it will sweep away everything in its path. The story of the Bobbitt spouses in the early 90s shook the world, and their surname became a byword, spawning the verb to bobbit, which means to cut or to chop. This case drew heightened public attention, not just to the issues of domestic violence, but also to such a delicate subject as marital assault, which many try to sidestep. Lorena Leonor Bobbitt was born on May 15, 1970 in the town of Bucale, located in eastern Ecuador near the province of Chimborazo. She was the youngest child in a simple and very modest family. When she was in elementary school, her family moved to Venezuela and settled in Caracas. Lorena grew up quite clever. She performed well in school, was diligent and goal-oriented. In her teenage years, she lost her father, and her relationship with her mother, Elvia Gallo, was quite strained. As soon as she graduated from school, she decided to move to the United States to live with her cousin, Jana Basutti. Her relative gladly took her in and helped her with the paperwork for a student visa. However, she was a very conservative woman. So Lorena, living in her house, had to abide by a strict set of rules, just like Jana's own children, and also take on some of the household duties. Despite everything, the young woman decided to stay in the US, as she realized that it offered her far more opportunities than Latin America. She had long been attracted to the beauty industry, so Gallo decided to train as a manicurist. Moreover, Basutti owned her own beauty salon located in the city center, had extensive experience in the field, and was eager to help her niece learn the profession by allowing her to observe the work of the specialists and practice on her own. Later, her aunt arranged for her to work part-time in her salon. About 8 months after she moved to the new country, the young woman had settled in, enrolled in college, and was working as a manicurist in her relative's salon while gradually saving money. In September 1988, Lorena was preparing to go to a party with several of her friends. Her aunt gave her strict instructions on how to behave and what time she needed to be home, and she promised that everything would be fine. The modest young beauty was nervous as it was her first time preparing to go to a nightlife establishment late at night. She chose a relatively modest outfit, unlike her friends, applied makeup, and styled her hair fashionably. Upon arriving at the nightclub, she was struck by the carefree and festive atmosphere. Inside, the venue was filled with young people dancing, having fun, and socializing. And Lorena couldn't help but think that such a place might be where she could meet the man of her dreams. This thought proved to be prophetic. A few minutes later, she noticed a very attractive young man intently looking at her and smiling. He waved at her and she waved back. Then the young man approached her and introduced himself. He was John Bobbitt, and he could not take his eyes off the young beauty with the quite exotic appearance. The guy was handsome, tall, and charismatic. He cracked jokes and skillfully paid compliments, so she couldn't resist his charm. They spent the evening dancing and chatting, and afterwards, the new acquaintance walked Lorena to her aunt's home. As they said goodbye, he asked for her home phone number and promised to call soon. John Wayne Bobbitt was born on March 24, 1967, in Buffalo in the northwestern part of New York State. He was the youngest of 3 children in his family. At the age of 3, the boy lost his father, who tragically died, and his mother, unable to cope with the shock, ended up in a psychiatric clinic after a serious nervous breakdown. All 3 children were taken into the care of their religious aunt and uncle, who wanted to help their relatives in this difficult situation. The boy was still very young at the time, but the events that occurred undoubtedly left a mark on his life. The aunt and uncle raised the children with strictness in accordance with religious canons. They all attended church every Sunday and engaged in charity work, trying to help those around them. John was not an outstanding student, but overall he did fairly well in school. As a teenager, he decided to pursue a future in military service. After undergoing the necessary training and special preparation at a military academy, the young man joined the ranks of the Marines, where he proved himself as a brave, disciplined, and determined young man. However, after a few years, the strict regime and the need to obey in the army began to weigh on him. After leaving the service with some military experience and skills, he was hired as a security guard at one of the city's popular establishments. But he later changed jobs frequently, not staying long at any. The day after they met, John, as promised, called Lorena to ask her out on a date. The young couple simply walked through the park, engaging in easy conversation about various topics, and John made it clear that he wanted to continue their relationship. Lorraine was not opposed to this, but according to the rules set by her aunt, she had to introduce her boyfriend to her before they could start a serious relationship. John accepted all the conditions, and on the appointed day, he came to dinner at the home of his beloved's relative. Bobbitt was very sweet, courteous, and considerate, yet he made an effort to appear serious. He managed to make a good impression on the strict Jana, and after a serious one-on-one conversation with the young man, the woman allowed her niece to continue seeing John. 6 months after the start of their romantic relationship, the suitor proposed to Lorena, and she accepted. She was overjoyed, having always dreamed of a family, children, and a home of her own. The couple began preparing for the most important event of their lives, and in June 1989, shortly after Gallo turned 19, they made their union official. The wedding celebration was quite modest as the young couple did not have the money for a lavish ceremony, and they chose to spend their savings on a honeymoon by the warm ocean coast. They were happy, but the only shadow over the celebration was the absence of the bride and groom's parents. Instead, their aunts and uncles came to share the joyous moment with them. After the wedding and a delightful honeymoon, the couple moved to Virginia and settled in a quiet and cozy area of the city called Manassas. The first few months of their life together were like a real fairy tale. They enjoyed each other's company, showing mutual tenderness, care, and love. But as the new year of 1990 approached, the situation began to change for the worse. At first, Lorena tried not to pay much attention to some of her young husband's remarks and rudeness, thinking it was just a so-called adjustment period. But one day, when she served cold soup for dinner, her husband simply threw the plate on the floor and then started yelling at his wife, insulting her and calling her a terrible homemaker. She tried to argue, pointing out that John Wayne, he closely monitored where she went and who she spoke to. At home, She had to follow the rules he set, and intimacy between them occurred only when John wanted it, regardless of Lena's wishes. The poor girl couldn't share her problems with anyone as she found the situation shameful and humiliating. On June 22, 1993, John, along with his longtime military buddy, decided to go out to an entertainment venue. The men partied and drank until late at night while Lorena was at home alone. She did not wait up for her husband and went to the bedroom around midnight, soon falling asleep. Around 3 in the morning, a drunk and aroused John returned home. He didn't waste any time and ripped the shirt off his sleeping wife. Lorena hardly understood what was happening. When her husband forcefully took advantage of her, she begged him to stop and not to do this, crying. But he was completely indifferent to her pleas and tears. After it was over, John simply collapsed next to her and fell asleep. Lorena, trembling and sobbing, made her way to the kitchen. She poured herself some water and took a few sips to calm down. But then her gaze fell on a stand with large, sharp kitchen knives. Her hand reached out on its own and pulled out a carving knife. Out of her mind, she went back to the bedroom, where her husband lay on his back, snoring drunkenly. She grabbed his genitalia with her left hand, squeezed hard, and sharply cut through with the knife, severing a large part of it. John jumped up, screaming in agony, while Lorena simply walked out of the room, went to the garage, and got into her car, speeding away through the deserted nighttime streets of the city. She only came to her senses at an intersection when she saw a red light at the traffic signal. At that moment, she looked at her blood-stained hands and realized that she was still holding the severed part of John's body in her left hand. She rolled down the window and threw the detested piece of flesh out, then continued driving. Lorena headed to the home of a close friend who was stunned by her nighttime visit and the state she was in. After Lorena told her what had happened, her friend, realizing the gravity of the situation, called the police herself and summoned a medical team to the house where the injured Bobbitt was. Precision surgery was required. Throughout this ordeal, John was desperately trying to stop the bleeding by pressing a sheet against his wound. Notably, the groin vein is a major vessel, and its injury nearly always results in death from blood loss. However, John was somewhat fortunate, if one could say that, because a clot had formed, significantly slowing the blood loss. The responding medics arrived in time to transport him to the nearest hospital, where he received immediate medical attention. The question then arose about the whereabouts of the severed part of his genitalia, as it was still possible to reattach it to its original place with restoration of its initial physiological functions. Lorena indicated the approximate area of the road where she had discarded her husband's anatomical fragment, and after an extensive search, the police were able to find it. The amputated organ was cleansed with antiseptic, then placed in a special container with medical ice, and urgently transported to the hospital, where the injured party was already being treated. The surgeon who arrived from the state capital was astounded by the complexity of the situation, as he had never encountered such a case before. But he proceeded with the operation anyway. He performed a unique surgery for that time, which lasted more than 9 hours and was more than successful. Despite the traumatic amputation of the organ and the fact that it had lain on the road for over an hour, all tissues and vessels were successfully reattached, and the patient quickly began to recover. Public outcry ensued. That same night, Lorena was arrested and taken to the police station for questioning, as well as to clarify all the circumstances and motives of her actions. She immediately confessed to everything and shared her harrowing story that had driven her to such a desperate act. She recounted how 4 years of marriage had turned into a real nightmare for her, with her husband regularly abusing her both emotionally and physically and forcing intimacy only when he desired. Mrs. Bobbitt also mentioned how, about a year ago, her husband had forced her to terminate a pregnancy despite her deep desire to have a child, and that abortion had been a traumatizing event for her. Regarding the incident itself, she said she remembered very little of that night and had acted as if she were in a fog. Lorena recounted how her husband had come home drunk and simply taken advantage of her, and although she tried to resist, he ignored her. After the incident, she went to the kitchen for water, and the next thing she remembered was her husband's scream, the roar of the car engine, and the part of his genitalia that she was clutching in her hand as she sat behind the wheel. The case caused a significant stir in the press and was actively covered by the media. Many women like Lorena, who had suffered from domestic violence, as well as feminist organizations which were gaining strength and popularity at the time, rallied to her side. In the early 90s, wives who were subjected to emotional and physical abuse by their husbands typically remained silent about their plight. Society was still inclined to blame the victims themselves, suggesting that they provoked conflicts or behaved improperly. It was assumed that a wife should be submissive and obey her husband in everything. And if the husband was dissatisfied and resorted to violence, it was considered the wife's fault. It was her fault. Intimacy in marriage was considered a duty of the wife, not open to discussion. On the other hand, almost all men sided with John. Many feared that Lorena's act might prove contagious, prompting other women suffering from physical and intimate violence in marriage to also take up knives. According to official statistics, there were several million such women in the country at that time. Trials and sentences of the spouses, two parallel court cases, began almost simultaneously. Lorena officially charged her husband only with taking advantage of her on that fateful night. Although in court, she detailed the years of regular abuse and beatings, emotional violence and humiliations she endured, as well as the abortion she was forced to undergo against her will under her husband's coercion. John's testimony was confused. He denied all allegations against him. But much of what Lorena said was corroborated by facts. For instance, it was confirmed that he did not have steady employment or a stable source of income, yet he loved spending time in entertainment venues, often forcibly or deceitfully taking money from his wife to do so. Additionally, Lorena's friends confirmed that they had repeatedly seen bruises and scrapes on her body, and she had been in a depressed state for a long time, though she tried not to complain. The court concluded that the husband had indeed abused his wife both emotionally and physically throughout their marriage, driving her to desperation. However, regarding the charge of intimate violence that occurred on the night of June 23, 1993, there was not enough evidence, and thus John was acquitted. He presented several versions of what happened that evening, and the jury, composed of 9 women and 3 men, found him not guilty. In the fall of that year, Lorena's trial began in September 1993. She was charged with inflicting severe bodily harm on her spouse. Her lawyers argued that she acted while suffering from PTSD caused by the ongoing emotional and physical abuse from her husband. A psychiatric evaluation was ordered, which confirmed that she acted in a state of distress, unaware of her actions, and therefore could not be held responsible for what she had done. In early January of the following year, after nearly 8 hours of deliberation, the jury decided that Lorena could not be held criminally responsible for her actions, as she was in a state of insanity at the time of the offense. However, she was required to undergo a 6-week treatment program at a specialized clinic, after which she was able to return to her previous life. The spouses officially divorced only in 1995, after which Lorena reverted to her maiden name. What became of John later? John remained indignant for a long time that his wife faced no punishment for her actions. He decided to fully capitalize on his sudden notoriety, aiming to extract as much money as possible from such scandalous fame. John founded his own music band called Severed Parts, but the group was short-lived as it failed to garner any public interest. When offered a substantial fee to star in adult films in the late 90s, he did not hesitate to accept. Thus, he appeared in explicit films titled Frankenpenis, a play on Frankenstein, and John Wayne Bobbitt Uncut. John acted in several more films of a similar genre, but interest in him and his reattached organ quickly waned. For a long time, John was eager to appear on various talk shows and gave interviews extensively. But over the years, such offers became less frequent, and the story gradually faded from memory. John then found work as a bartender in an entertainment venue in Las Vegas. And by his 50s, he was struggling to make ends meet by taking jobs as a mover, driver, and pizza delivery man. In 1999, he received a suspended sentence for theft. Regarding his personal life, during the high-profile court case that the entire country followed, journalists discovered that Bobbitt had an illegitimate son named Andrew, born in 1992 to one of his lovers, Beatrice Williams. In 1994, John was brought to trial for assaulting his new girlfriend, Christina Elliott, who worked as a dancer in a nightclub. He spent 15 days in jail for this and received probation. In the early 2000s, John was arrested 3 times for assaulting his then-wife, Joanna Farrell. This time, he was imprisoned for a year for violating his probation. They officially divorced in February 2004. What happened to Lorena? Unlike her former husband, Lorena did not take pride in her scandalous notoriety and tried to stay out of the limelight. In 1996, she decided to return to her native Ecuador, where her mother, Elia, was living at the time. However, just 6 months later, Lorena made the news again when her mother accused her of assault. The conflict was resolved without going to court, and the women continued to live together. A year later, Lorena returned to the USA, where she opened her own small beauty salon in Washington. In February 2007, She founded a foundation called Lena's Red Wagon, which focused on helping women who had suffered from domestic violence. Soon after, Lorena agreed to give an interview for the first time in a long time and appeared on CBS News Morning Show, where she discussed her life post-incident. She also appeared on the popular Oprah Winfrey talk show in the mid-2000s. Lorena remarried, and her new husband was a man named Dave Bellinger, with whom she had a daughter in February 2006. She preferred not to recall her marriage to Bob at all and claimed she did not follow his life after their divorce. In February 2009, nearly 15 years after their sensational legal battles had ended, the former spouses met face-to-face for the first time on the show, Insider. John apologized to Lorena for the way he had treated her during their marriage and declared that he still loved her despite everything. Lorena was visibly moved by his words and confirmed that every year on Valentine's Day, her ex-husband still sends her flowers and cards. 8-year-old Mariah Martinez was the oldest of 3 children. She and her siblings lived with their mother, 27-year-old Amanda Martinez, in Lubbock, Texas. On October 6, 2016, Mariah's brother, 5-year-old Jeremiah, spoke with Child Protective Services while he was at school. He told the social worker that his mother had gotten into an argument with her boyfriend who had then punched Jeremiah in the nose. Jeremiah also reported that the boyfriend had threatened to kill Jeremiah and his entire family by driving them into a pond. CPS was further concerned when Jeremiah told them that his family had been living with his 45-year-old maternal grandfather, who was a registered sex offender with a 2002 conviction for aggravated sexual assault. On October 17th, the school contacted CPS again because both Mariah and Jeremiah had not been in school in a week. That same day, their mother, Amanda, was given a drug test and tested for methamphetamine. The Texas Department of Family and Protective Services obtained a court order removing Mariah, Jeremiah, and their 2-year-old sister, Leah Maya, from their parents' custody and placing them in the custody of the state. However, when officials from CPS went to enforce the order and collect the children at their home, they and their mother Amanda were gone. Law enforcement was notified and missing persons reports were filled out on the 3 children. Amanda Martinez was located and arrested on November 1st. She told authorities that her children were with an uncle in New Mexico, but investigators who followed up on the statement found that they were not. Amanda was released. On November 30th, the state of Texas issued a capious calling for the arrest of both Amanda and her mother, 44-year-old Deanna Martinez, each on a charge of interference with child custody, a state felony. Investigators believed that Deanna, who had her own history with CPS stemming from a 2006 investigation, helped take and hide the children in violation of their court-approved custody orders. She was arrested in Albuquerque, where she lived, and transferred to the Lubbock County Detention Center on December 30th. Amanda Martinez would remain free for a few more weeks. On January 17, 2017, police received a report that Amanda had returned to Lubbock and had dropped off her children at the home of one of her relatives in the 8900 block of University Avenue. Officers arrived on the scene and placed Amanda under arrest for the interference with child custody charge. Both Jeremiah and Leah Maya were found in the home, but Mariah was not there. Amanda refused to tell authorities where Mariah was, what had happened to her, or why she was no longer with her brother and sister. In April, Amanda pleaded no contest to the felony charge and was prohibited from having contact her children for 3 years. She further was subjected to a curfew, had to perform 120 hours of community service, could not patronize any establishment that sold alcohol, agree to DNA testing, and attend substance abuse treatment. Since Mariah's mother would not help locate her, authorities turned to the community for help. On March 23, 2018, Mariah's case was featured in a segment on the A&E show Live PD. The segment featured Angeline Hartman from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Pictures of Mariah and the details surrounding her disappearance were featured, and while Mariah went missing from Texas, viewers were advised that her family also had ties in New Mexico. It would be this connection to New Mexico that would ultimately help find Mariah. After seeing Mariah's story on the show, a viewer who recognized her called in a tip, reporting a sighting of her in Albuquerque. The New Mexico State Police began following up on the information provided for the person who called in the tip, conducting several interviews and surveillance as a part of their investigation. On Monday night, March 26th, just 3 days after her story was featured on television, Mariah was located at an apartment in Albuquerque. It appeared she had been taken care of during the time she was missing. The now 9-year-old was placed in the care of the New Mexico Children, Youth, and Families Department. department. The apartment where Mariah was found belonged to members of her extended family. They were aware that Mariah had been reported missing but opted not to report her whereabouts to authorities. The New Mexico State Police did not charge them with any offense to interference with the custody order in place in Texas. They did perform a follow-up investigation that did not reveal any signs of abuse or neglect of Mariah while she was with these relatives. The fact that she is in good health is a relief to the people who hear about these stories. New Mexico State Police Lieutenant Elizabeth Armijo said after Mariah was located, "This is the whole point of having segments on these kids and putting faces on the news. There are success stories.